Hi, in this training we're going to be discussing how to use interviews to collect data. We'll talk a little bit about different types of interviews, the advantages and disadvantages of using interviews versus other data collection methods. We'll talk about how to design your interview guide, so writing the questions that you're actually going to ask during your interview, how to order them. We'll also talk about how to recruit participants, who you should try to recruit, how to sample these individuals. We'll also discuss obtaining informed consent and ensuring confidentiality. We'll talk about how to actually go about and conduct the interview. So how to present yourself, how to ask for more information, and finally we'll talk about how to actually use your interview data. So there are a number of different ways of collecting data. Interviews being one of them, among as well focus groups, surveys, document and record analysis. And by interview, we mean a one-on-one conversation between the interviewer, so someone from your organization or hired by your organization, and a participant. The interviews typically last for about an hour. Depending on how many questions you have to ask, they might last a little bit less, they might last a little bit more, but you really don't want to have them last too much over an hour, just because people's attention spans start to wane after that period of time. Some respondents will be happy to talk all day long. You also need to protect your time as well too. So typically an hour. If they go over a bit, that's fine as well. There are two types of interviews that you can conduct. The first are structured interviews, and this is when the questions are set in advance. There's a list of questions, and the interviewers are expected to go through those questions one by one and ask them in the exact way that they're written on the interviewer guide. And in this sense, they're a lot more like a survey, that there's not this room for flexibility. And one of the advantages of using this method is that it's easier to compare across responses, that all the people being interviewed are getting asked the exact same questions. The other method, and what's more commonly used, is called semi-structured interviews. In this type of interview, most of the questions are set in advance, so there's a list of topics, a list of questions, all of these already written out, but the interviewer can also add in follow-up questions. And they're also free to change the order of the question if the conversation shifts towards questions that they're going to be asking later on. So this gives a lot more flexibility to the interviewer. It allows them to pursue topics they might not have thought of before. So for example, if the interviewer brings up a point that they hadn't anticipated, they can ask them to tell them more about it, ask them specific questions about that new topic. So for this reason, we'd really encourage you to use semi-structured interviews. That this gives you more flexibility, they take a little bit more practice to conduct, but they tend to provide more useful data. So like any data collection method, interviewing has advantages and disadvantages. So we'll first go through some of the disadvantages. The biggest disadvantage is that there's a strong social desirability bias when conducting interviews. So this means that participants want to look good. There might be some opinions that they don't feel comfortable expressing. So common ones include racism, sexism, voting for a particular political party. So they may be uncomfortable expressing these beliefs or opinions in front of an interviewer. So if you have a topic where social desirability plays a strong role, it's typically better to use a survey in which they're not having as personal of an interaction with the interviewer, or they're filling it out on their own and not having to interact with another person. Conducting interviews are time consuming, recruiting the participants, and then you're going to spend at least an hour with them, maybe even more, actually conducting the interview. So the time ratio to the number of responses is quite high. Focus groups and surveys both take a lot of time to prepare, but when you're actually conducting them, you tend to get more responses more quickly. So if you do an hour-long focus group, you're going to be getting between 6 and a dozen responses. If you spend an hour going out and trying to conduct a survey, you're probably going to get more than one response. Another disadvantage of interviews is that you have a smaller sample. Mini surveys have hundreds of respondents, maybe even thousands of respondents. You just can't do this in interviews because the amount of time that it takes. So you tend to have a smaller sample. So it's more common to see between, say, 10 and 60 interviews conducted. You would never see this for a survey because you'd always want to get more responses for a survey, but this is about the number that you'll get when conducting interviews. So one drawback of this, and because you tend not to do random samples, is that you can't generalize about the population. That you just don't have enough respondents, you're not selecting them in a way that would allow you to generalize about the population. So if you want to have a larger sample, if you want to generalize about the population, surveys are both much better methods. Finally, the data analysis process for qualitative data, including interviews, is a lot more open to interpretation. You're not going to be able to come out and say 60% of the respondents believe this, or be able to say there's a strong correlation between level of education and gender. In interviews also, because the questions might change slightly, the order might change slightly from interview to interview, it's harder to compare the responses. So if you want a more straightforward data analysis process, if you want to be able to more compare responses, surveys again are probably going to be a better option. That said, interviews also have a number of advantages. Interviews are really good for getting in-depth information that you just can't get either in a focus group or in a survey. So you're spending an hour one-on-one with another person, and you're really going to better be able to understand complex processes. So it's much better for understanding why and how. So why someone chose to do something. So if you're interviewing female politicians, understanding what led them to become female politicians. How did they get involved with politics? What were the challenges that they faced? So understanding their experiences, understanding their emotions, these topics aren't as a minimal to being used in surveys. Additionally, as we discussed before, in semi-structured interviews, the questions are flexible to change during the discussion, during the interview, unlike in surveys. So this really lets you follow new topics and learn a lot of information that you might not have anticipated learning before. Because unlike a survey, you're not designing all the questions in advance. You have that room, unlike in a survey, to add in additional questions in the course of the interview. So certain questions, research questions that you have, information that you want to find out for your organization, certain questions lend themselves to one method or another if you're looking at surveys and interviews. So for example, if you're interested in finding out, do citizens participate in civil society organizations? Or what civil society organizations do participants or do citizens participate in? Surveys are going to be the better method for you, that these are fairly straightforward questions to ask. You can ask a large number of people fairly quickly. However, if you're interested in understanding why do citizens participate in civil society organizations? It's possible to do this in an interview or in a survey. You can have open-ended questions where you record down the answers, but these tend to be quite short answers. You could also come up with a list of possible reasons that you think are the most common and have a close-ended question with multiple choice. But interviews are really good to let you find out the nuance and the details of why citizens participate in civil society organizations or why they don't, because you can actually have a 5 to 10 minute conversation just about this question with your respondent. And they might tell you, well, I wanted to, but I didn't because of X or Y, or I did go to one organization, but the experience wasn't good, so I decided not to go back. Or they might talk about being inspired by a friend or a family member. So getting a lot more detail, a lot more nuance. Interviews often are used in conjunction with surveys, although they don't have to be. So for example, a lot of times people will conduct interviews before they actually design a survey. This is useful in generating response categories. So for example, the previous example we just talked about, why do citizens participate in civil society organizations? You might be able to brainstorm a handful of them. but there might be common ones that you just haven't thought of. So you can conduct a series of interviews and ask these questions, and then based on the responses you get in your interviews, you can design your multiple choice options based on these responses, and then use a survey to be able to find out more information about a larger number of people so that you can generalize these responses. Interviews are also useful for seeing how participants respond to questions or to language before you go out and spend a lot of money deploying the survey and surveying hundreds of people and finding out that you have a problem. You can use interviews to see if people seem confused by questions or by certain language and revise them accordingly. Interviews can also get used after you've conducted a survey. So if you've conducted a survey and you have surprising results that you just don't understand, maybe there's a correlation, a relationship between two variables that you just don't understand. So let's say that you're interested in the amount of time people spend commuting, and you find a strong correlation between gender and the amount of time people spend traveling to work each day. There's not necessarily an obvious reason why these two variables might be correlated, what the relationship is. So you might actually use interviews to go and ask these questions about, okay, so how long do you spend commuting? What leads to this length of the commute? Find out about the opportunities for jobs in different areas based on gender, and you might be able to find out the reason for this relationship. So interviews and surveys, they work very well in coordination and in conjunction with one another, but you can do each of them separately. And again, it's really figuring out which is going to give you and your organization the information, the data that you need right now that's going to be most useful for your immediate purposes. When selecting interviewers to conduct your interviews, ideally you'll have one interviewer conducting all of the interviews. This is useful because then you have consistency throughout the interviews, everyone's talking to the same person, but this isn't always possible. You might be conducting interviews in different geographic locations, or more interviews than one interviewer can handle in a certain amount of time. You might also want to have interviewers of different genders or different backgrounds, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But whoever you have conduct interviews, they should be friendly, but also professional. So approachable, but not too friendly. They should also remember that they're representing your organization. They should be comfortable talking to strangers. This might seem obvious, but a lot of people go out to conduct interviews and they realize they really aren't comfortable talking to strangers or having this structured type of conversation. They should be able to maintain consistency across interviews. It doesn't have to be identical in the same manner that we tend to strive for in a survey, but they should be as similar as possible. The interviewer should be knowledgeable about the interview topic, especially because in semi-structured interviews, they can add in questions based on what the respondent, what the participant is saying. So they should know enough about the topic so that way they can come up with useful questions on the spot based on what the participant is saying. So because of that, it's really important that interviewers are able to speak on their feet. And finally, it's important that the interviewer is also fluent in the language in which they're conducting the survey. So that way they're able to pick up on nuances in what the respondent is saying, and that they're able to communicate clearly what questions that they're asking. The availability of interviewers, it will vary widely depending on your linguistic, geographic, and/or demographic criteria. You may not have a very big selection pool for who you choose to be interviewers, but you should try to get interviewers that meet all of those previous criteria as much as possible. You should also consider what criteria, if any, you want to match interviewers with participants. So for example, gender, age, ethnicity, religion, and this is going to really depend on both the interview topic and the cultural context. So for example, if you're talking about public transportation, the gender, the age, probably the ethnicity and religion of the interviewer isn't going to have that much of an impact on the participants' responses because of this topic. However, if you're asking about reproductive health, If you're asking about sexual practices, you almost always want to match the gender of the interviewer with the gender of the respondent. If you're asking about societal discrimination, you're probably going to want to match the interviewer with the participant based on ethnicity or possibly religion, depending on what type of discrimination you're talking about. So think about the topic and how the identity of the interviewer, so characteristics about them, may impact the participants' responses. Additionally, depending on the cultural and societal context, there might be other criteria that are important to match. So, for example, even if you're asking about transportation preferences or choices, if it's not seen as appropriate for an unrelated woman and an unrelated man to be together in private having this interview or Skyping and having this interview, even if the topic isn't specifically about a taboo subject or about a sensitive subject, you want to follow those societal and cultural contexts, and in that case, you match the gender of your interviewer with the gender of your participant. So now we're going to talk about the interviewer guide. And the interviewer guide is basically the list of all the questions that you're planning on asking in the interview in the order that you think you're going to ask them. And again, because this is you're probably doing a semi-structured interview, the actual order, the actual questions may change a bit in the interview. So you want to make sure that you write out all of the questions you plan to ask in advance. And exactly how you would ideally ask these questions. This is important because it ensures that you don't forget to ask questions in the interview. So the interviewer will always have a copy of the interview guide with them, and they can check off the questions as they've asked them. So that way they can keep track of what they have and haven't asked. It also enables you to avoid confusing and or leading questions because you've been able to write out the wording, the specific wording in advance. It's very hard to ask good interview questions on the spot in the middle of an interview, especially if they're questions that are key to the data that you're trying to collect. It takes a lot of practice to ask good questions, to ask questions that are clear, and ask questions that aren't confusing or leading. So writing them out in advance is really important, especially in the early stages of the interview process. It also enables consistency throughout interviews, so that way you're asking as similar questions as you can across all the interviews you're conducting. And this is especially important if you have multiple people conducting the interviews, multiple interviewers, so that way they can be consistent as well too. Additionally, it enables you to estimate the length of your interview, that you can see how many questions you're asking, think about how long it might take, rather than just doing it on the spot in the middle of the interview. A lot of people say, okay, I'm conducting the interview, it's semi-structured, I can add questions, I can take questions away, I don't need to write these questions out in advance. Don't be tempted to conduct the interview without first preparing an interview guide. This is really important for the quality of your data, for the consistency of your data as well too. So it's really important that you have this interviewer guide prepared. And depending on the length of your interview guide might be 2 pages, could be 6 pages. You might have sets of questions for specific respondents that you don't ask of everyone. So for example, if you're asking about transportation and transportation preferences, you might be particularly interested as well as how do parents with young children, do they have a different experience with transportation? So you might have a separate set of questions, a module of questions that you only ask of parents and don't ask of people without parents. So the length might vary a bit depending on what you're asking. But the interviewer guide really enables you to plan out the entire interview, to think it through as well too. So this is the most important thing that you'll do in preparing for the interview. So when you're designing the interviewer guide, do start your interview with a few simple questions to build rapport with your respondent. The interview is much more like a conversation than a survey. So you should view the first couple of questions as warm-up questions to get people comfortable with talking to you, that you are probably going to be a stranger to that person. So you don't want to start off with really difficult or really serious or sensitive questions at the beginning. You want to have simple questions that don't require a whole lot of thought from the respondent, that just allows them to get comfortable sharing with you and get comfortable with the interview process, especially if they haven't been interviewed before. You want to have your questions be written in a conversational tone, so you don't want them to sound overly formal. So think about questions that you might write in a survey or encounter in a survey. In many cases, if you are these aren't worded in the way that you would ask them if you were having a conversation. So you want to make sure that when you look at your interviewer guide, that the questions you see there are things you actually would feel comfortable saying in a conversation, that they're written without too many clauses in them, too many qualifications in them, that if someone heard them and didn't read them, it would make sense to them. Additionally, you want to keep the questions short and clear. And you want to group questions about similar topics together. So that way you're not jumping from one topic to another topic to another topic. And you want to have transitions between these topics. So you might say something like, okay, so we've talked a bit about how you as an individual use public transport in the city. So now I want to talk about how you and your family use public transit and how you and your children use public transit, and then move into those questions. You also want to keep track of how long the interview is taking, so you want to have a watch with you, or some way to discreetly check time. Some respondents will say very little, others will say a whole lot. You want to make sure that you don't spend an entire hour on two questions and then have to skip or rush through the last of the questions. So you want to make sure that you're pacing the interview appropriately, that you have enough time to finish it all in the amount of time that the participant has agreed to speak with you. It's also helpful if you brainstorm possible follow-up questions in advance. That this makes it easier to ask them during the interview. So you might think, do you use public transit? And if they say yes, and they say that they use buses, you might have some follow-up questions that are specific to buses, as opposed to subways, that you're prepared to ask. You shouldn't assume that you'll remember all of the questions without the interview guide, as we discussed. So always have your interview guide and always have a copy of it with you during the interview. Don't assume that you'll come up with good questions on the spot without practice. If you haven't prepared your questions in advance, it's very easy to ask leading questions or unclear questions. So as you begin to design the interviewer guide, think about what you want to learn as an organization and what information the respondents can accurately provide. So for example, say you're interested in trying to find out what factors lead to gender equality in households. So what leads to equality between husbands and wives, parents and children in households? Many respondents wouldn't be able to answer this. They might not even be able to answer, is there gender equality in their household? Because they might have different understandings of gender equality. Or they might just not be aware of the dynamics that lead to the gender, that leads to gender equality or inequality within their household, or on specific factors. So you don't want to ask them this question right out. Instead, you want to think of different topics that you can address that will lead you to being able to answer this question and to know more about this question. So, for example, some topics that can tell you about whether there's gender equality in a household and what factors contribute to it. You might ask about the decision-making process, financial, life decisions. So one of your questions might be, so think about the last large purchase, say over X amount, that your family made. What was it? And tell me, how how your family decided to make this purchase. And they might say, well, my spouse decided to do it, or we had a conversation about it. And you can follow up with questions to ask them in more detail about that process. You could ask them about who takes care of the children within the household. And just because the husband or a wife takes care of the children, it might not be due to gender necessarily. You can ask, and so why is it that your spouse takes care of the children? And you might find out that they earn more salary, so their spouse um, stays at home and takes care of children, or that one person works irregular hours and the other is able to be at home when the children are awake. All kinds of different details. You can talk about the distribution of household responsibilities like chores, and the relationship between the spouses. So all of these are topics that you can ask questions about that help you get to this larger question that you're interested in. One of the goals of conducting interviews is that you can get detailed and nuanced responses. However, in order to do this, you also have to frame your questions in a way that elicits, that encourages detailed responses from your respondents. You want to avoid asking people about general experiences. If you ask about general experiences, you're going to get general answers. So if you ask someone to tell you, so tell me about your experiences when you go to the doctor's office, you're going to get a very general answer. Well, typically it's okay. Typically I have to wait. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. This is going to give you some useful information, but it's not going to be the most useful information. Instead, ask participants to think about a particular experience. And oftentimes this you'll cue them with either the first time, the most recent time, the best time, the worst time, but that causes them to actually think back, to reflect back on a particular experience. So take that question we just discussed. Tell me about your experience when you go to your doctor. Instead, if you say, think back about the most recent time you visited the doctor. Tell me about it. What happened when you went? What were you satisfied with? What were you not satisfied with? And you'll get a very much more specific answer. Oh, I had broken my leg and I went and I waited for 5 hours before I saw a doctor. I waited and no one came and told me what was going on. When I went to do the x-ray, they x-rayed the wrong leg. And you'll get a lot more useful information to include. You want to avoid yes or no questions. If you ask yes or no questions, your respondent is going to say yes or no. And you're going to have to probe them to get more information. So it's much better to avoid yes or no questions in the first place. Remember, the goal of the interview is to generate content. If you just have a list of yes or no responses, you might as well have done a survey. So in order to do this, you should ask open-ended questions. So instead of asking, have you communicated with your government representative before? Which is a yes or no question. Instead, ask them to tell you about the last time you communicated with your government representative. So again, this is good because you're cueing to a specific occurrence to make them think about specific details, and you're also asking a question that's going to result in a longer answer and a more detailed answer. And finally, you want to probe during the interview for more detail. So have follow-ups to encourage the respondent, the participant, to give you more details. And we're going to discuss in a little bit types of probes that you can use during an interview. As you're designing your questions, you want to avoid specific wording, specific types of questions. First of all, you want to avoid questions with loaded terms. And loaded terms are words with negative or positive associations. So for example, think about death penalty versus killing criminals or murder. This might be you might be asking about the same thing, but killing criminals, murder, is going to have a much more negative connotation than the death penalty, which is the term in many places in common usage. Think about the terms assistance to the poor versus welfare. Welfare often has a strongly negative connotation. You additionally want to avoid leading questions that suggest a right answer, and sometimes this involves mentioning an authority figure. So for example, instead of asking the question, do you agree with the recent High Court ruling that the press should be liable or held responsible for criticizing the government? This isn't a great question because one, it asks, do you agree? people are much more likely to agree if they're asked to agree than if it's not written that way. And second, it refers to the high court. So it makes people think, well, this authority has said this, and they're more likely to agree with that. So a better way of wording this question is, do you think the press should be held liable, responsible, for criticizing the government? Here, it's equally as likely that someone's going to say yes as they're going to say no. Whereas the first wording, it's much more likely they'd say yes. Additionally, in the second question, you're not referring to the authority of the High Court. Another example of a leading question: pilot survey studies have been shown to significantly improve the final survey results. Do you plan on conducting a pilot study? This is a leading question because in the first part of the question, you've told your respondent that conducting pilot studies is a good thing, that it improves the quality of results. So it's much more likely that the respondents are, even if they haven't been planning on conducting a pilot study, that they're going to say yes because it sounds like a good thing. So a better way of wording the question is, do you plan on conducting a pilot study? Why or why not? Finally, you want to avoid what we call double-barreled questions. This is when you ask about two or more issues at once. How satisfied are you with the government's policies on taxes and education? Here you're really asking two things. And someone might say, oh, I'm really satisfied, and talk a little bit more. And the problem is you don't know if they're really satisfied with the policies on taxes or the policies on education. Additionally, people tend to forget if you're asking too many things in a single question. So they may talk about the government's policies on taxes for 5 minutes and forget that you even asked about education in the first place. So a better way of structuring this is to first ask a question: how satisfied are you with the government's tax policies? And then, once the respondent has answered this, ask, how satisfied are you with the government's educational policy? Another thing you want to keep in mind when you're designing your interviewer guide is the idea of social desirability bias. So respondents don't want to look bad. They tend to underreport illegal activity, stigmatize diseases, offensive beliefs, anything they might be embarrassed to admit to, like racism or sexism. And they tend to overreport desirable behaviors like voting or recycling. You might ask social desirability questions in your survey, in your interview, and that's okay. But you want to be aware that you're asking them. And in particular, you want to be aware of who's asking the questions, who the interviewer is, because the interviewer also has an effect on social desirability. So for example, if you're asking questions about what does the respondent think about women's equality or women's political participation, if the interviewer is a woman, research has shown that participants are much more likely to say that they have a stronger support for women's equality than if the respondent is male and with a female interviewer, there's a much higher chance that the male respondent will say they support female equality. However, if the interviewer is another male, the response is going to be less strong, that they're not going to be as supportive of women's equality. And that's because they might feel embarrassed telling a female interviewer, that they don't support women's equality. So you want to think about who should give the interview if you're asking about questions that have a social desirability bias or questions about sensitive items. If you are asking sensitive questions and questions that are likely to have a social desirability bias, it's better to place these questions later in the interview. This way you have time for the participant and the interviewer to build up trust with one another. If you talked with someone for half an hour, you're going to feel much more comfortable talking about sexism or racism than if you're talking about this topic in the first 5 minutes. And again, think about whether you need to match characteristics of the interviewer with characteristics of the participant. So, as you finalize your interviewer guide, the interviewer should practice with the interviewer guide. This is extremely important, that the interviewers are familiar with what is in the interviewer guide. That if a respondent brings up a topic that's later on in the interviewer guide, that the interviewer is comfortable switching over to that other topic. The interviewer should practice interviewing people that they already know. So if you're conducting the interviews, a good technique is to ask a friend, to ask a colleague, if you can practice the interview on them. It doesn't matter if they're of the same population, um, that it doesn't matter as much that the questions apply to them. The most important thing is that you practice interviewing with someone who's going to give you honest feedback, someone who's going to feel comfortable telling you the way you asked that question didn't make any sense. Or they might say, you seem really nervous, or you need to slow down, you need to ask the question not as fast, or you sound really uncomfortable. Um, so practice with people that are going to give you good feedback. Also, it's important to practice interviewing a stranger. And this is someone whose data you're not going to use in analysis. So maybe it's someone, a complete stranger you ask to participate. Maybe it's a friend of a friend that you don't know. But it's also important to have that interaction with a stranger. Because conducting an interview with a stranger, sitting down, having an hour-long conversation with someone you don't know can be awkward. So it's really important to get over that initial awkwardness. And again, this should be an interview that you're not planning on using the data for. An interview that if you mess up, it's okay, that you can make all the mistakes you need to as long as they help you to do a better job when you conduct the actual interviews. So now I want you to take some time to think about your interviewer guide, and you're going to write some sample questions. So first, think about what are the main topics you want to cover in your interview. In what order do you think it makes the most sense to cover these topics? Then look at each topic. What questions do you want to ask for each topic? And list these questions out. And once you've drafted these questions, go back over your questions and look at them. Do you ask leading questions or questions with loaded terms? Are your questions clear? Are your questions in the best order? Does it make sense the order you're asking them in? Do you think that social desirability is going to affect your interview? And if so, how might it affect it? Are there ways that you can mitigate this or lessen this? So take a few minutes to work on this, and when you're done, continue on with the training. We're going to now talk about how you actually find people to participate in your interviews. One thing to keep in mind that unlike a survey, interview results aren't generalizable to the population. You're often not doing random sampling, you're typically not talking to a whole lot of people. So the way in which you recruit the respondents isn't as technical as what you will do for an interview. It's still really important that you pay attention to it and put a lot of effort into it, but in a different way. So most interviews use a convenience sample, and this means that you choose participants based on your ease of access to them. So these might be people that you've posted flyers asking for people to participate and they say yes. You might ask other organizations to tell you names of people that might be willing to be interviewed. There are all kinds of ways of recruiting these people. But the key here is that you're asking people that you already have access to. So it's critical that you think about biases that might be introduced in the manner that you're recruiting these people and think about how to address them. So for example, are you only sampling people? Are you only interviewing people that you already know or already have a personal connection with? In many cases, people tend to be very similar to their friends and family members, so you're not going to get a big diversity of opinions necessarily. It's important that you talk to people you don't necessarily know so you get new ideas. It's also important to think about, are you only asking people of, say, you're interviewing 20 people. Are these 20 people all from a particular age group? Are they all from a particular socioeconomic status? All male, all female, all from a specific geographic region? This may or may not matter. Depending on the topic of your survey. However, typically you want to get variation because you're not you might have some ideas that, say we're talking about transportation and people's attitudes towards transportation. You probably want to have a variation in socioeconomic status because wealthier people might use public transit and are likely to use public transit differently from people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. Maybe gender's not as important, that gender isn't necessarily obviously related to the way in which people use public transit, but it might be. So if you can, you should have variation in gender, variation on these key demographic characteristics. So again, it's important to think through your survey, think through, or whether through your interview, and think about how people's responses might be biased based on how you're choosing them. If you're getting them all from your own neighborhood, the neighborhood that you live in. Again, if you're talking about public transit, people in your neighborhood might have different public transit options, bus stations close by, train stations nearby that people in another part of your city don't have access to. So think about, is it important that you interview people from other geographic areas? And if you think it is, you should go out and try to include these people in your interviews. We call it a convenience sample, but this doesn't mean that it should be the most convenient sample. So it doesn't mean you should just talk to friends and family members or people that you work with. It takes time and effort to assemble a good sample, a diversified sample on these factors that we discussed. So you want to make sure that you've spent the time and effort to think about who would be able to provide you with useful information. So in recruiting participants, you want to think about what population are you interested in. Is it the residents of a city? Is it parents, municipal council members, women, youth? If it's youth, what ages? Once you've determined this population, think about what demographics may be important. So for example, we might have a slightly narrow population and we're just interested in women, women in general. And our topic might be, do women participate in politics or not? Do they run for elected office? Do they participate in political campaigns? You want to try to include, as we discussed, participants of different backgrounds, and it's going to depend on your study topic. But as we discussed, different ages, maybe ethnicity, maybe religion, socioeconomic status. That if we're talking about women in political participation, we can imagine that age would matter, depending on your country, ethnicity might matter, socioeconomic status might matter. Maybe parental status would matter, that parents might be less likely than non-parents to participate in politics because of the time commitment. So if you think that parental status might matter, you're going to want to try to include a mix of parents and non-parents in your study. Maybe education matters as well too. So make a list of all the different types of categories that might matter. You might not be able to get interview respondents from all of these categories, but you've at least thought it out. And in looking at your data at the end, you'll have an idea of how your sample might be biased. So you might only end up being able to interview non-parents. Maybe for whatever reason you couldn't find any parents that were willing to participate. Then when you're analyzing your data, you can analyze it with the caveat that we only talked to people who were non-parents. And that there's entirely possible that there's a relationship between being a parent and participating in politics or not participating in politics. So we can't really draw any conclusions about the relationship between parental status because we haven't talked to any parents here. So this is important to think about in advance. So a big question that gets asked is, how many interviews do you need to conduct? What is the number of interviews you need to conduct? There's no magic number. Aim for at least 10. This enables you to have some variation. If you're just talking to a couple of people, it's hard to know whether this information might apply to the general public or if it's just dependent on these two very specific individuals. So 10 people gives you some variation, but ideally you'd want to have even more than 10. So the typical range is probably between 10 to 40, maybe sometimes more interviews that people will conduct, but aim for at least 10. Another way to determine if you're conducting enough interviews are you reaching a saturation point? And this means that you're conducting interviews, but you're not really getting any significant new information. You're getting largely the same responses from your respondents. This probably means that One, either your sample isn't varied enough. So for example, only talking to parents versus or talking to non-parents versus parents, or it means that you're sort of finding this general consensus among the people that you're interviewing, and that you're not going to get that much useful new information from subsequent interviews. So this is also a good thing to keep in mind as you're interviewing and thinking about whether you need to conduct more interviews. So, how can you find people to participate in your interviews? A common practice is to post flyers in public locations with the contact information for people to contact you. Say, I saw your flyer looking to talk to people about public transit, I'm interested. And then you can follow up and ask them to participate. You can also target specific areas or groups where your population goes. So, for example, if your population is university students, you could go to a university and try to recruit people to participate. So, post flyers, hand out cards with the information on it, asking people if they'd be willing to participate. You can ask for local community members to help in recruiting participants. And additionally, you can use what's called snowball sampling. So this is asking participants, so people who already participate in your interview, for recommendations of who else might be good to contact. So think about it, if you have a snowball on a hill and you push the snowball down the snowy hill. As it rolls down the hill, it gathers more and more snow, so it becomes bigger and bigger. So that initial snowball at the top of the hill is your first participant or two that participates. They give you a name, and the next person gives you a name, and your sample grows and grows until it's a big ball by the end, ball of snow by the end. This is particularly useful if you're trying to find a population that's hard to find or that might not be willing to talk to outsiders. So say you're talking to an ethnic or religious minority and you're not a member of that religious or ethnic minority. Having an introduction within the community is often a good way to be able to recruit additional people. Or say that you're interested in a public health intervention and you really want to interview drug users, people who engage in some sort of illegal activity, or people engaged in prostitution for a public health program. It's really hard to walk up to people in the street and say, hey, do you use drugs or are you a prostitute? So you need an in, and one end is if you find one person that's a member of these communities or engaged in their activities, they might be able to tell you about other people and say, well, you might talk to my friend. And because you've already talked to this participant and you're able to approach this potential participant and say, your friend recommended that I talk to you, because you have that introduction, they might be more willing to participate. Finally, you might consider using incentives. The most common incentive is a small monetary incentive. It's not a lot of money, but it's a way to encourage people to participate who might not already. You're not paying them to give you specific answers, but you're paying them to participate and give them your time to take part in the interview. And incentives are particularly useful, again, if you're having a hard time recruiting people or recruiting people from a particular group. So once you've actually found your participants, you want to set up a time to conduct the interview that's mutually convenient for both of you. That's probably at least an hour long, maybe longer if you think your interview is going to run longer. You want to choose a location that's quiet and a place where you won't be disturbed. So common options include a room at your organization, the participant's home. It could also be done via Skype or via phone. You want to make sure that it's a place that is comfortable and not public, that it's private. If at all possible, you want to conduct the interview in person. Conducting interviews in person, it's much easier to establish trust and a good dialogue between the interviewer and the participant. You can also pick up on body language, which is really useful in framing your questions and having a conversation. If you're talking to a stranger, it's much easier to have that conversation in person than over the phone. However, this might not always be possible, especially if you're trying to reach people in remote geographic locations or geographic locations that you can't travel to. Once you've set up the interview time and location, always call your participant the day before the interview to remind them of the time and location, and also to give them directions on how to get there if it's a location that you've chosen. Take a few minutes to think about your population of interest. How you're going to go about sampling or finding this population. So are you going to post flyers? Are you going to use snowball sampling? Work through members of different community organizations? And what are the potential sampling biases that this method is going to introduce? So for example, selection bias. Who's actually going to be asked to participate in the interview? Is it only going to be people of a particular geographic region, only people of a particular ethnicity or religion, only men, only women? And think about how you can minimize these biases. So for example, if you are interested in learning about the experiences um, of women in politics and you want to make sure that you have both parents and non-parents, you don't want to post flyers only at schools or daycare centers. So places where parents of children would go, but people without children wouldn't go. You'd want to post them additionally in public places. So think about what your potential sampling biases are and how you might go about minimizing them. And once you've taken a few minutes to do this, then you can go on to the next set of slides.